I tapped him on the shoulder and I said, Harvey, you need to come with me right now. And you never interrupted Harvey in a meeting. And he turned round and he saw my face and he heard my tone of voice and he got up and he came with me straight away without questioning. At that moment, I was almost more terrified because I realised that what had happened clearly had happened.
Otherwise, he would never have done that.
He would have never have done that. He would have had no idea why that was happening.
Welcome to the Parrhesia Tapes, a podcast about whistleblowers and whistleblowing. My name is Natasha Lovel and I work for Parrhesia, a whistleblowers charity, and I'm a campaigner for the rights of women. I'm joined by my co-host Martin Bright, who's a journalist who's broken many people's whistleblowing stories and is the editor-at-large at Index on Censorship.
Thanks, Natasha. And our expert today is Professor Kate Kenny from the University of Galway. Kate has 10 years of experience of talking to whistleblowers, has written 2 books about whistleblowers, and is particularly interested in the impact that whistleblowing has on people that blow the whistle.
But finally, and most importantly, we have Zelda Perkins, who is our whistleblower today. She was the first woman to break her NDA against Harvey Weinstein, and since then has raised awareness of the detriment of non-disclosure agreements and co-founded Can't Buy My Silence alongside Professor Julie McFarlane. I think the first question that's important to ask is, I introduced this podcast as being about whistleblowers, but I know that that's not a title you necessarily agree with or hold. Why is that?
I guess the reason that I prefer not to use that vocabulary is I think moving forward, we want to be able to see speaking up or reporting as normal. If you tell people, if you keep the myth of it being brave, it makes it harder for somebody to do because they go, well, I'm not brave. I'm not a brave person. I'm not a leader. I'm not somebody who wants to stand out. And it makes it more frightening. If you are just doing the right thing, it's not as frightening. I also think things like victim, survivor, and whistleblower are all quite, they have quite a lot of negative connotations to them for the individual. So I think moving forward, it would be really good if we could have more positive vocabulary around, those actions.
Absolutely.
But I don't disagree with the description.
Yeah.
Can I come in and just ask you, it would be great if at some point you could come up with a term for us. That would be fabulous. We're all looking for a term that is more appropriate than whistleblower. But could you talk maybe about the moment that you decide to, let's say, speak up or speak out, if you're happy with those terms? What
report a problem. That's all I thought I was doing.
Yeah. So what I think is interesting to hear about for those of us who perhaps haven't been in that position, let's not say haven't been brave, but haven't been in that position, haven't felt it necessary. Could you just take us through that moment for you? Or maybe it wasn't a moment, maybe it was a process.
Well, again, I don't know, which moment do you define as when I whistle blew?
Well, which moment would you define as when you...
Well, I wouldn't define any of them as whistleblowing. But I mean, initially, obviously, when my colleague came to me and said that Harvey had assaulted her, I didn't think about whether I was whistleblowing or whether I was doing anything wrong. I thought I was doing something perfectly normal and correct. If somebody comes to you and says they've been sexually assaulted, the first thing that you would do is report that. I wasn't in a position to go to the police because of the geographical situation we were in, which was on a small island off the island of Venice, and there wasn't police or a police station. And also the assault hadn't happened to me, so it was slightly. There was a slight step back, but I immediately actually went and confronted Weinstein. So I don't know whether that would be called whistleblowing, because if you go to the perpetrator and accuse them directly of something, I'm not sure if that's whistleblowing. In my view, I think whistleblowing is probably going more to the organisation.
Well,
But
he is the
was the
organisation.
organisation.
He was the organisation, it's true. He then effectively lied to me, but also by lying to me told me the truth.
Take me through that.
Yeah.
Well, he was sitting having a meeting. I went down. I was very agitated, obviously, and he had his back to me. And it was a meeting that I knew he was a particularly precious and important meeting to him. And as I was walking over there, my biggest fear was that I was going to have to do it publicly, because I knew that if he didn't get up and come with me, I was going to have to do it publicly in front of one of the most famous directors in the world and a couple of other people.
Who was?
Martin Scorsese. And that was my only fear, because I was like, if I do this publicly, then he really will. He might just shoot me or just strangle me on the spot. I might just take a blow to the chest and die immediately. But I tapped him on the shoulder and I said, Harvey, you need to come with me right now. And you never interrupted Harvey in a meeting. And he turned round and he saw my face and he heard my tone of voice and he got up and he came with me straight away without questioning. At that moment, I was almost more terrified, because I realised that what had happened clearly had happened.
Otherwise, he would never have done that.
He would have never have done that. He would have had no idea why that was happening. And we got into the hallway of the hotel and I accused him and I asked him what happened. And he said, absolutely nothing happened. And I swear on the life of my wife and children, which was a phrase that he used always. It was his best get out of jail card. And I just said, you're lying. And then, in terms of the whistleblowing action, when we got back to I didn't allow my colleague back into a room with him. And when we got back to the UK, I went to my immediate superior, who was a woman, and told her what had happened. And I think that actually was the first really dreadful moment. In a way, it was worse than what my colleague told me, because she didn't look surprised. And she said, well, you're going to need to get yourself a good lawyer.
So she knew exactly what to do at that point.
Yes, but what actually she should have done was told me that this needed to go to HR and the police.
Yeah.
And I think that moment was really where the bottom began to fall out of my world. And I was like, okay, things aren't progressing the way I expected them to progress. And I think that's probably what happens to a lot of whistleblowers, is that they do what they think is right. They go to the first point of contact where they think that the process is going to be taken on and dealt with properly, and they're met with the wrong reaction. And I think that's when that's when you maybe have a choice about your whistleblowing.
Well, yeah, if I can jump in there. I mean, this is what the research shows. And I think a lot of people assume there's this one moment and you wake up in the morning, today I will blow the whistle, the world may change and so on. But from talking to whistleblowers, actually it's a series of small moments. Each one of those often, I feel, represents a chance to turn back or not go forward. And I suppose what defines a whistleblower that we would, or let's go a little broader because of exactly for the reasons that you've talked about, Zelda, somebody who's prepared to stand up and speak the truth and to continue on that process. What we find is it's usually a series of steps. There is research that shows that some people will just disclose 4 or 5 times. And what they're looking for each time is the same thing. Someone who is independent, who will take the information and act on it. And if it takes successive steps to go and find that person, people persist in doing it. So it makes it a little bit more complex, isn't it, when we sort of talk about the motivation. But I think that from where you've ended up with not only talking about the wrongdoing, not only supporting colleagues, but now working to change the system, takes that whistleblowing onto a whole new level, right? Because it's kind of what can happen from identifying those things and where you can go with it. So,
absolutely. And I think you talk basically about an open secret, especially when you went through this extraordinary experience for trying to support someone in another country. You don't have necessarily the same access to police or legal aid. You come back and try to raise it to your superior, and it does seem like a known secret, an open secret that people are happy to go along with. Before this had happened, and it was at the Venice Film Festival, did you have an indication that that was the case, that people knew that this was happening?
No. No, and I think, again, this is another conversation, but it's all very well when people go, well, everyone knew it was happening. What did people actually mean by it? I don't think anybody knew that Harvey was a serial sexual assaulter. Everybody knew that he was a bully. Everybody knew that he behaved inappropriately with women, but then so do so do a lot of men in positions of power. And people and women in positions of power. I have worked for equally abusive women. They just they don't have the sexual power, but they abuse their position of power and are bullies and abusive. And this is a societal and cultural problem. It's our sycophancy to power and fame and, visibility. But it's also obviously a hierarchical issue. If you work in a company, you don't have... there aren't fair arms. Of course there aren't. And there can't be, because there has to be hierarchy within work. But when it comes to, calling to account a superior, it's a very difficult thing to do. And that's why the system has to protect that. And for me, it was always about the system from the moment that I spoke to my superior, but then more worryingly when I spoke to lawyers. And that's really when, for me, everything changed. And then it became not being about Harvey, really. This was about a system that enables, protects, and completely allows those in power to behave with impunity.
So after being told that you basically had to lawyer up and that trying to bring something of this scale to the attention of your superior, what was your next step? What did you do?
I called the Citizens Advice Bureau.
And what did they say?
It was a long time ago.
Good for you.
I didn't know what else to do. And they said that I should consider myself constructively dismissed because of the behaviour of so it's a legal term, because of the behaviour of my superior. Basically, they said you need to go to the police, etc., etc., etc. And I explained how that was a bit difficult.
At this stage, had you been dismissed?
No.
Right.
No, I hadn't been dismissed at all. But if you basically, it's a way of resigning. And you say, I am constructively dismissed because of the behaviour. At the same time, I actually spoke to a lawyer in the US, which was very informative because it was the first person who gave me some indication that I did have some power in the situation. My colleague didn't, but I did because of my knowledge of Harvey. And I then went and found a lawyer who was 2 streets away from the office because I didn't know the difference between a employment lawyer or a commercial lawyer, I just went to a solicitor's office, which was across the street. So 2 things happened when I went to a lawyer. I discovered the extent of abuse that I had personally suffered, which I had not really acknowledged or understood. Which sounds like I'm being stupid, but we didn't have vocabulary of sexual harassment or that kind of thing, in 98. So that made me take a step back because I felt pretty stupid. And I also realised that, again, maybe I had more power in this situation in terms of, when I say that, I mean in terms of us finding justice through the courts, because that was all that I was imagining would happen. And I think the other thing is that I very much realised that, I was speaking up for someone else, essentially, for someone else's assault. And it is easier to speak up for someone else. And actually, in my entire journey, I talk very little about what happened to me. And I'm in a privileged position that I don't have to, because so many other women suffered at the hands of Weinstein and have all spoken about it very articulately. And I've always felt that actually it's a distraction from what I'm trying to highlight, which was not Harvey's behaviour, but why Harvey was allowed to behave the way he behaved.
Can I just ask you, though, I know you don't see yourself as a particularly brave person, or you don't want to see yourself as a whistleblower, but you were relatively junior
Very
at this point.
I was 23.
And yet you decided that you were going to confront this extremely charismatic and powerful individual in front of a Hollywood director. Have you considered what it was in you that drove you to do that when others hadn't, right?
Well, I've had to, because everyone keeps asking me, and just saying, well, that's me, doesn't really answer the question. Yeah, there are a couple of things which are very clear. One of the reasons, and this is a very sad reason, is that I wasn't particularly ambitious. And a lot of the reason that people didn't speak up and don't speak up in all different sectors is because of their care for their career. And ambition shouldn't be a bad thing. And so when I say it's because I wasn't ambitious, I don't mean that being ambitious is bad but it was my protection, because I didn't really care what happened to me. I was like, what's the worst that can happen to me? Genuinely, what's the worst that can happen to me? He can shout at me. He can fire me. I mean, big deal. But that's quite a luxurious position to be in. You know, a lot of people, that job is, and particularly working for Weinstein in that time in the 90s, you know, it was the pinnacle. It was the place to be. And not just in the movie industry. At that time, Harvey was one of those weird, sort of multi-powerful figures. You know, he had a lot of power in politics. He had a lot of power all around, everywhere. And I had sort of walked into the job by mistake, naively. That seems to be my excuse for everything. I'm an accidental campaigner. Got a job working for Harvey. But it meant that I wasn't afraid because I didn't need anything from him. And that's an unusual position to be in. My colleague, this was her dream job. And that was her Achilles heel. And that's shockingly sad. It's sad that being ambitious, particularly as a woman, should be an Achilles heel, that should be a vulnerability. But that's partly the truth. I think, secondly, it was my first job. I had been brought up a nice middle-class girl where, you know, men didn't swear at women and didn't behave inappropriately with women. And I just thought he was a monstrously badly behaved, disgusting man. And I believed in the system. I believed, you know, my grandparents brought me up, so I had quite old-fashioned ideas. Whether I was old-fashioned or not, it would beg the question. But I, you know, was brought up to believe in the establishment. And I think that's why then when actually I went to the law and our justice system let me down, that was a far more seismic to me than a man's weakness. And it made me, but I'd always looked at Harvey's behaviour and wondered and been slightly disgusted by the way everybody behaved around his power. And it was my first introduction to true power.
Yeah, and one thing that I'm fascinated by, a lot of whistleblowers we speak to describe how they become politicised through, you know, that idea of realising the system is broken, or realising that the story you've been told as a child, that things work, that the law is in your favour.
There is no Father Christmas.
Oh, stop. We can't continue. We'll have to edit that out, yeah. I'm afraid. But untrue. But really, that it's that moment of realisation that can turn people's minds. And people talk about how afterwards they are political in ways, and I mean political with a small p. They're not going off voting for some party or other. They are more attuned to power and domination and more dedicated to fighting abuses of both of those. In terms of your view of the system and sort of men behaving nicely and politeness, and that the system works, did that change your views when it came to, say, feminism, or when it came to sort of women's rights? Did you find that you became politicised through these realisations that you had from this experience in your early 20s?
I didn't immediately. I mean, I think I had always had a very strong feminist kind of natural belief. I had studied women's literature at university, and I'd post-colonial and women's literature. So I had some form of vocabulary and thought around that. But for me, this was never about gender. And I would say that I've become much more feminist. But I mean, a true feminist it's about equality. It's not about women being better or stronger or whatever, or women having more. But I think for me, I've always felt it was quite important that this wasn't limited to gender. Yes, statistically, women are victims more in the abuse of power. But I think for people to really understand and to move forward, the most important thing to understand is that this is about the abuse of power and what part all of us play within that.
And I remember reading something that talked about the fact that when you broke your NDA, your non-disclosure agreement, you were dizzy with excitement. And every single report I've read about the cases to do with Harvey Weinstein is these young, vulnerable women. And I think the framing of the case is so interesting. And I know that you've written quite a lot about how gender intersects with whistleblowing, and I am taking it down a slightly gender lens. I completely agree that it should be about how power is trickled down within organisations. But I'm just going to ask a question that you ask yourself in one of your papers. How does gender and power intersect in whistleblowing situations, in your experience?
I mean, it's really interesting to be here with Zelda and talk about this. One story that is fascinating, I don't know if we recall, some of us are old enough to remember the Time magazine issue of, I think it was 2000, and they decided to feature 3 whistleblowers on the cover, 3 female whistleblowers from Enron, WorldCom, and last one was a US government whistleblower, if I recall correctly. And so the author of the article, faced with 3 powerful women whistleblowers, proceeded to sort of make generalizations about how they were sort of brave, but yet brave in a subtle, self-effacing way. And the bravery and the courage was very much tempered through a polite lady feminine lens. So I think that it's always really complicated because we can't just say gender plus whistleblowing equals this mix or that mix. But I think an intersectional approach is the way to look at it. Each one of these represents, each one of these disclosure examples and represents a scene, and gender or race, in some cases it's age, more and more it's job security or lack thereof. Those different elements that come to play when it comes to equality at work, they can take on different mixes in a given setting, and that's kind of what we're always interested. And it's back to what Zelda mentioned as this mix of power and how power is playing out in any given situation. I know, for example, the campaign website that Zelda and Professor McFarlane have set up is really interesting in terms of the research it draws and shows some pretty frightening statistics around intersectionality. For example, when it comes to race, that women of colour in some surveys report being 3 times more likely to have had an NDA contract in front of them and been asked to sign. And this often comes alongside people working in the kinds of professions that might be more susceptible, whether it's hospitality or other areas, and also the kinds of jobs that come with less power within the hierarchy, power within the system. So it's really kind of, again, a story of power and domination and how inequality can come to play. But I think the thing that we're focusing on now is this new form of contract, the NDA, and how that is shaping who gets to speak up and who is silenced. And I think that's something really important to explore.
I think that's a good point to jump back to taking us as the listener back into that law firm and having to sign an NDA. What happened?
Well, obviously it wasn't described to us as an NDA. And, something that I think we'll talk a little more in detail about NDAs later, but it's important to understand that these agreements don't come with NDA stamped on them. Non-disclosure agreement can just be a confidentiality clause in any form of agreement. It can be one line in any form of agreement. But if that line is stopping you from speaking about your experience or abuse, or, it is a non-disclosure agreement. So yes, when I think on that first day, it was made very clear to me that if we wanted to take this to court, our lives would be ruined. And actually, the current Post Office drama that is just been shown on ITV, I think has been a fantastic example of how good, upstanding people fall at that first fence where they get legal advice and a lawyer tells them the truth, which is that they're better off to plead guilty or accept money and sign an NDA than tell the truth. And for me, that was an awful, awful thing to discover. And to have, a lawyer sit there and tell me that my options were basically zero access to justice. My option was a damages agreement. That was what it was described as, where I would get a payment for the damages incurred, a nice reference, and I could tootle off and everything would be fine. And I was absolutely incensed and said, no, the first thing is no money must change hands, because if money changes hands, it changes the entire dynamic of what we're doing. Then it looks like we're trying to get money for something. I also very naively thought that any legal document that was created was like a court document and would be in public record. I mean, this just shows how naive.
But so many people think,
yes, and most people don't know much about the law. And so it was very important to me that this agreement was very clear description of what it was. And I saw the agreement once it was very clear that we couldn't really go down a court route because we would be destroyed, our families would be destroyed, our reputations would be destroyed. And in fact, the first thing the senior partner at the firm, Simons Muirhead and Burton, that I went to, said, have you or your family got any skeletons in your closet? And I was like, well, yeah.
Probably.
But also that was the other thing, and this kind of brings us back to the question of why people make a choice to whistleblow or not. That was the first point where I realised this wasn't just about the harm that might be caused to me if I spoke up. This was about the reverberations of damage that would come if I spoke up, because this could essentially mean that my family were made bankrupt, that my mother's death would be brought into the public domain, that my behavior, I would have been made to look like an unreliable witness, that my best friend's drug habit might suddenly come into the whatever you want to imagine. Suddenly you realise that you actually have to think about the people around you. And I think for most people in a whistleblowing situation, they have school fees to pay, they have a spouse to think about, they have family reputation, they have, a mortgage to pay, they have all of these things. And in some ways, it happening to me when I was so young, I didn't have any financial issue, but I did have my family and, I was at the beginning of a career. So our only offer was that we went into an agreement, a settlement agreement.
And what did your colleague want to do?
Well, it was very different for her. She was the person who had, been through a personal assault and trauma. She also had her own cultural history and issue that complicated it for her. It was her dream job. She wanted to be able to get straight back into the film industry. And I think she probably responded in a more natural or a more common way that people do in that situation. She just wanted to sign it, get some money and go away. And poor girl was attached to me, who just wanted to expose the whole thing and fight and make it as big and public as possible. So we kind of had a compromise, which was that for me, the agreement, I was like, okay, so if we're going to have to sign an agreement, and the lawyer said, you have to accept money. You have to accept money, because if you want to do all the other things that you want to do with this agreement, i.e. curtail Weinstein's behaviour, the way you start this process is negotiating finances first. Once you've got that negotiated, then we can do all the other weird things. Literally, this is how they were responding to me, that you want to do. Because in my eyes, this agreement was our only weapon. So I needed that agreement to do everything it could to stop Weinstein's behaviour. So we had all sorts of crazy demands.
What
and in
was
fact, the partner at the law firm handed us over to a junior solicitor female junior solicitor because he felt that our demands were unreasonable. Now, our demands were that Harvey went to therapy, that he was not allowed to travel with women, alone assistants, that the company had to put in an HR policy so that people knew their rights around behaviour and misdemeanour, that that money was paid to a women's centre. There was a bunch of things which we felt would at least have some positive action in changing Weinstein's behaviour, that he would be fired from the company if he attempted to settle again with somebody over sexual assault. So the process of the lawyers making us feel like we were being unreasonable trying to do this was really what was the hardest part to deal with and the most disheartening part to deal with.
Can I ask you about that process that then started and ended many years later with another major disclosure? So you are now in a position where you have signed this agreement. Of course, the irony of this situation that a number of whistleblowers face is that whistleblowing procedures themselves can bring about people's silence. So in fact, you're quite right that in some circumstances, whistleblowers shouldn't really be described as whistleblowers because they've gone through a procedure that in fact silences them, which is pretty much what happened to you. But then there's a later stage, obviously, where you become a whistleblower again, although you may not describe yourself as such, where you decide that this situation can go no further, and you decide to speak out again. Could you just, again, take us through that process?
Well, if we want to go with the analogy of whistleblower, I was blowing my whistle consistently for 23 years and just nobody was listening. And I think actually that's also key to the whole process of speaking up, is that it's getting to the right people who will listen to you and who's safe. I think just quickly to go back to what you were saying about that process of whistleblowers being silenced, that process, and that's very clear in the testimonies that we've gathered on our website, and I'm sure you're very aware of, but that process is often more traumatizing than whatever it was that the person was speaking up about initially. That whole process from the moment that they report is actually where things start to fall apart. And I think that's key to the whole.
I agree. And if I may, I don't think people understand just how insidious that settlement and silencing agreement are. They have impacts that go far beyond what we often assume. I mean, in cases such as the one we're speaking about, you're asked to sign away your rights to receive counselling, to sign away your rights to receive medical treatment, unless the counsellor or the doctor are also going to sign an NDA. And I think Zelda and Rowene, others have spoken about how difficult it is, if not impossible, to get your doctor to agree to sign an NDA with Miramax if they're willing to treat you. We shouldn't laugh, but the lengths to which these practices go to ensure silence, providing a list of people that you might have spoken to, friends and family about it. Now they're involved in legal documentation, providing your diaries. It's really incredible. And I think what you're speaking about is the deep internal guilt that people seem years later to come away from, having signed the settlement, not having wanted to do it, and carrying that sort of burden, which is a horrendous sort of thing to carry with you. So I think these are some of the aspects. And also, I'm not sure people realise how little money actually often changes hands. I mean, this is money changing hands for the sake of saying money changed hands. These amounts are typically quite small.
Yeah, they're usually £2,000 or £3,000.
Right. And then the lawyers keep 40% of this, roughly, is my understanding.
Very small cut.
So I think, when we read about this stuff in the media, it's a settlement. Okay. And this is sort of, exaggerated or given the impression. So it really, people talk about just the problems of having done that and how difficult
Well, and of course,
it is to
people
go
can't
through.
talk about how much they've been paid either.
No, because they're not also allowed, in many cases, as I think is the case in Zelda's, that they're not allowed to keep a copy of it. And I think it was...
Which is completely illegal.
Right, exactly. And the illegality of asking someone to sign away their speech rights in cases of criminal activity or fraudulent activity or gross misdemeanor is, clear as well. So, yeah.
So, Zelda, you're saying that essentially whistleblowing or speaking the truth doesn't work unless anybody's listening. You, during this period, were trying to get the word out there. But what was happening?
Yeah, unless the right people are listening. And I think, I was in a difficult position, obviously, because I'd signed an NDA that had said I couldn't speak to the police, that I couldn't speak to the HMRC, that I couldn't speak to a doctor. And I genuinely believed that if I broke my NDA, I would go to prison. I would be sued. I had come away from that experience feeling that I was the criminal, and that because I had signed this agreement, that was me agreeing, which it was on one level, that I was going to hold this secret. But as time passed, you realise that, as Kay was just saying, you hold guilt. Because as much as that agreement being signed was a win in some ways for Rowena and I, because Harvey agreed to go to therapy. He agreed to put in an HR system. He agreed that he would be fired if he tried to make another settlement, which to me was also a win, because I was like, well, if anybody sees and when people see this agreement, and he paid us both £125,000, which in 1998, that was huge. But that was also something we had to argue for. And I'm sorry I've gone off point slightly, but when we come back to the money thing, our lawyers advised us that the maximum we could ask for was a year's salary. Now, I'd been there for 4 or 5 years. Rowena had only been there for a month. So for her, that was a fairly reasonable settlement. For me, I was like, but a year's salary means nothing. It's not indicative of the crime. Because for me, that payment was, if it was a damages payment, it had to be indicative of the crime. So I literally made up the biggest figure I could think of and said that, I said, what would it be? 40,000 maximum for both of us if we got a year's salary. That's not even one flight for Harvey. That's not one flight on a private jet. That doesn't mean anything. And if we're going to have to accept money, then it has to mean something. It has to show his guilt. So we asked for a big amount of money, and our lawyer said to us, if you do that, you are not going to get any reference, you will not get a settlement, they will walk away, and you're going to be left with no job, no career. That's the only time that I genuinely was afraid and had a moment of bravery, because I had to tough it out. And I said to the lawyers, you're wrong. It's because you don't believe us. It's because you don't believe that he's done what he's done. They will bite your hand off because he's guilty. And the lawyer said, well, we have to give you the advice to not do this because they'll call your bluff. And I said, you go ahead. And I did that evening. I remember I was absolutely terrified. And the next day they came back and they were like, oh, okay, yeah, they said yes. But that's an unusual circumstance. And again, I think most people who are put into a settlement situation don't get very much money.
No, that's right.
It's not enough for a life of silence, really, talking about, and especially given the experience that Rowena had, not being able to properly access counselling, or you don't know when, and as you've said, you don't necessarily realise until afterwards the consequences of the actions that were even towards you. You don't realise how something's going to impact you later on in life. But
I tell you what does impact you, when you sit in a room with a bunch of erudite lawyers who, two well-educated, Rowena had been to Oxford, I'd been to Manchester University, I studied philosophy and English, we were a product of our fantastic system. But to sit in a room with 5 or 6 lawyers, hear Harvey also admit that he had done this, which he did in our final meeting when we signed the contract, and for all of them to allow us to sign a contract that said we couldn't speak to the police with somebody who'd admitted to a sexual assault, that was what broke me. And that's the thing that makes you think nobody's going to listen. Who's going to listen? If all these lawyers aren't going to listen and they're meant to uphold the law, who's going to listen? And I think that's something that happens to a lot of people. You lose faith in all the people who should potentially be able to help you. And, you know, our naivety, I felt, was very much preyed upon. But what I discovered later when I was part of a government consultation on NDAs, you know, we're talking back now in 2018, you know, I met people in that consultation, in those rooms, who were lawyers themselves, who were people at the height of their career, you know, who were people who understood the system much better. And they were still having those restrictions put on them.
Journalists sign NDAs all the time.
All the time. And listen, NDAs do have a very legitimate role. And I think that's something I have to be very, very clear about, is that they have a very important role in the protection of IP, in the protection of client confidentiality, in the protection of patents and all sorts of things. What they don't have is a place to hide harm.
I think that's it. And I mean, if we can take a little, as the academic, nerdy legal pause to point out that I think what confuses people is any two adults are free to enter into any kind of contract that they wish. So people say, well, if somebody's agreeing to sign a contract and an NDA and the other person is agreeing to sign it, where's the issue? And the thing that people don't understand is that contracts have legal validity where there's no coercion, where there's the opportunity of legal representation, and where there's full understanding by both parties, then it counts. And so many of the circumstances, including the one that we're talking about today, does not fit that bill. So these contracts do not count as contracts when they're signed in this sort of circumstance. There's another thing that the campaign that Zelda and Judy McFarlane are running is so helpful. Another myth-busting moment, I think, that is really, really important for ordinary workers to understand.
And I think going back to that point about naivety and how that was preyed upon, in a previous episode, Professor John Blenkinsop talked about how a lot of people don't realise they're whistleblowers, and whistleblowers is an isolating term in a way, when actually an issue is just resolved. But they have been a whistleblower and that they've reported it and they've done the right thing and just brought it to someone's attention. In the same sense, so many people sign NDAs and have no clue that they have. How many NDAs do you reckon you've been presented with after breaking yours and the campaign that you've been running?
Well,
I guess
it is quite funny because I do get presented what I would consider NDAs, mostly in media situations. And again, it shows people's lack of understanding. I think one of the funniest ones was when the New York Times journalists came over to the UK to promote the book, She Said, which was the book that they published about breaking the Weinstein story, and they asked myself and Laura Madden and Rowena Chu, we were the three kind of main UK whistleblowers, or three UK whistleblowers, to come and do a talk with them at, it was an Intelligence Squared talk. And it was very intimidating. We had to go to this auditorium, with a 1,000-seater auditorium. And in the green room beforehand, we were given a little document to sign. And Laura and Rowena signed the document. And I read the document, and Clause 4 on the document was, you cannot speak about anything that happens at this event or any of the people who meet at this event. And I was like, excuse me, this is an NDA. And they were like, what? Well, no, don't be ridiculous. And I was like, have you even read your own disclaimer? And they looked at it and they were absolutely puce with embarrassment. And I said, well, I'm just crossing that clause out. It's fine, don't worry, I'm just crossing that out. But I suggest that you look at the documents that you hand to your guests in future. And then I did it very nicely. I did say when we were on stage, I said, I'm sorry to bring up this story, but this is a perfect example of how people don't realise how insidious this whole confidentiality clauses have become. And in the States now, they've made a huge step with Gretchen Carlson, who has a similar campaign to ours called Lift Your Voices, where they have now got through Congress with Biden's support. You now can no longer have a pre-dispute NDA within an employment contract, which in layman's terms means in America, it's very common that when you sign your employment contract, there's an NDA built in there already that you just wouldn't even notice. Which means that if something did happen, you're already signed up to not to be being gagged. So, that's not so pervasive here, but that's a big step in the US, to stop that. To go back to your original question about, which I'm sorry I keep getting diverted from, about the right people hearing you. I mean, I broke my NDA as fulsomely as I did in 2017, in 2013. There was and if you've seen the film or if you followed the Weinstein story at all, you'll know, but there's no reason anyone else would. But in 2013, there was an Italian model who had met Harvey. He had been sexually inappropriate with her, and she went and reported it to the New York Police Department. They wired her, asked her if she'd go back. So they wired her. She went back to meet with Harvey. He again behaved inappropriately. She went back to the NYPD with the evidence on this tape. And I happened to be in New York at that same time. Serendipitously, I was working there for a couple of weeks. And Ken Auletta, a very erudite and well-known journalist who's brought down a lot of great men and women, and helped a lot of great men and women, who writes for The New Yorker and had contacted me in the past, called me up and said, I know you're in New York, we've got Harvey, this is what's going on, will you come and talk to me? And I said, you bet I will. I've been telling everybody who'll listen for the last 20 years, nobody's done anything. And I went and saw Ken, and I told him very clearly what had happened to me. And the next day he wrote up the piece, he sent it to Harvey for his right to reply, and came back to me 24 hours later and said it's gone away. The district attorney have withheld the tapes, Amber has dropped her charges, and Harvey's denying everything. Well, Harvey wasn't denying everything. Actually, when Ken went to him, and there's a documentary you can see where Ken is interviewed, and he said Harvey burst into tears when he told him that I had spoken to him, and he said, you're going to ruin my life. But anyway, it was closed down. And that, for me, was a second 1998 moment, because I was like, okay, the lawyers wouldn't listen when I was a 24-year-old. We're now 2013. The New York Police Department and the District Attorney of New York have turned a blind eye to this. So this is systemic on such a huge level. And I think that was the last straw for me. And I think this is also going back to one of the things that you were talking about, the longevity of the abuse that being silenced has. I mean, I had spoken, Rowena had never spoken a word from the day we left that lawyer's office in 98. And we had never spoken to each other because one of the clauses was we were not allowed to speak to each other. And for her, that led to 2 attempts on her life. It led to a breakdown of a lot of her relationships because she couldn't be honest about anything. But for me, I had been carrying this guilt. And when it became very clear to me in 2013 that Harvey's behaviour had not changed at all, I then felt desperate, really, really desperate. But also I didn't know where to go because who was going to listen to me? And I think this is a huge problem for people who do speak up. And so I was very lucky, as I see it, that I was approached by Jodie Cantor in 2017. And But the reason I spoke to her really is I was at the end of my tether. And I felt at this point I had a moral duty to speak up. And that if the worst case scenario happened, which in my head at that time would be that I would go to prison and I might have to pay back hundreds of thousands of pounds, I genuinely felt that I was prepared to take that risk. But again, one of the reasons I was prepared to take that risk was because I was in the position of not having dependents, not having school fees to pay, not having a child or a husband or a wife whose life would also be impacted by that. And I think in many ways, if we look at the brave moniker, I think, again, for me, when you're only thinking about yourself, it's very different. And so in a way, I was perfectly placed to do what I did.
How much do you think that your campaign has helped? I mean, you don't like to describe yourself as a survivor either. You certainly don't come across as a victim, but nor do you seem right now to be obsessively going over again and again what happened to you. And in fact, you insist on not doing that. So I'd be very interested to know how important it is that you've now moved on to your campaign and how much that's given you the strength to survive.
It's completely instrumental in how I have survived. When I say survived, I talk about that for me, the survival is going through being in the public eye. Not about what happened with Harvey.
Yes.
The 3 years of the maelstrom of Harvey being brought to justice, all the different criminal and civil investigations and legal investigations that were going on, that I feel like I've survived from. And I feel unbelievably privileged to have been able to make something or be part of something positive out of ultimately a pretty negative experience, and negative the whole way through. I had no other choice. I mean, I say I was an accidental campaigner. I didn't have a choice. I didn't set out to start a campaign at all. I was just trying to achieve justice again. And I made the same mistake as I did when I was 25 in 98. I went to the, inverted commas, the grown-ups. So I went to Parliament. I was very lucky. I managed to get squeezed into 2 select committee inquiries and give very compelling evidence. And I thought then I could walk away. And I told the police everything I knew, and I told the SRA, the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, and the Law Society, all the people who could make change in the right place. I told them all, and they all went, "Oh my God, this is terrible." And then they looked at me and they're like, "What are you going to do about it?" Essentially. And it wasn't actually until lockdown that I accepted, and that was the hardest thing that I've had to do throughout the whole process. I accepted that I was going to have to start a public-facing, actual named with a silly name, can't buy my silence, have to have an Instagram account campaign. Up until that point, it had been just a personal trying to see through what I had started, because there was no point in me going public, losing my anonymity, losing my career a second time. I was very happily producing theatre successfully in the West End and on Broadway. Well, no one's going to employ me again to do that. I've spent 5 years doing this now, and essentially I've lost my career. I'm not saying that with my little violin out, but the same thing happened to me speaking up second time as it did first time. But this time I've controlled the narrative. And I'm privileged to have been able to do that, because not everybody can do that. Not everybody gets that opportunity. Not everybody has the public scrutiny and interest that Me Too and Weinstein brought to me, and survives the press scrutiny. And that, again, that could have gone completely differently. It is by the grace of God that the press decided to like what I was saying. They could have chosen to completely paint me as an enabler and destroy my life.
On this campaign, I'm thinking of listeners who are either coming through whistleblowing situations or in other forms trying to speak out about perceived wrongdoing. And you've talked about accidentally being in the right place at the right time, being fortunate with the media. But anyone who looks at your case, there's lessons that others can learn from the active way in which you've managed both to survive on a personal level, the public scrutiny, and secondly, the strategic way in which this campaign has grown and developed. And I wonder if you might offer advice on both of those counts, the personal survival and what kinds of steps can people take to make those sort of campaigns a success, to turn those sorts of moments of disclosure that can be so personally challenging into this kind of thing. I know there's no generalizing that's going to be easy, so I'm not asking for that, but I am thinking of people who are in similar situations because it's such a fascinating story.
I think you have to learn to use your anger wisely. I think anger is a very dangerous as well as powerful tool with campaigning. I also had to learn which battles, you have to be very clear about which battles are worth fighting. When I talk to people considering breaking their NDAs, one of the things that I ask everyone to always do is go very deep inside themselves and examine their motivation and what they actually want from this. And this isn't about judgment. It's not about saying it's right or wrong if you want revenge. But if you want revenge, you're not going to win. And if this is about anger and wanting to be heard, you're not necessarily going to win. You have to, for me, it was probably easier as I wasn't a direct victim, let's say. And for me, my battle has always been very clear from day one, from when I was, right at the very beginning. It was about the system. And it was about making sure that no one else had the experience that I had, rather than gaining revenge for the experience I had. And I think if you try and fight for revenge, you will exhaust yourself and you're more likely to be vulnerable to attack. And I think, and I may be wrong, but if I try and look objectively, because I find it mystifying myself, how successful we've been in such a short time with the campaign. I mean, there was 3 years of groundwork from me here in terms of getting political allies, media allies, and all of that is super helpful. And I would not be where I am today if people like Dame Maria Miller and Jess Phillips and Layla Moran and, various advocates within Westminster had helped me. And I think my biggest epiphany was really understanding that as broken as our politics are, democracy works. And if you engage with our politicians, they work for us. And there are good politicians and there are bad politicians, like there are in every industry. There are good and bad. But if you find the right people to listen to you, we are so privileged to live in a democracy. And yes, it's hard work. And yes, it doesn't mean it's going to happen straight away. But if you engage with the people who represent us in Westminster, then you do have the chance to move forward. You also have to learn how to play the game with the media. And that's something that, my God, that is like kind of being shot at by several cowboys shooting at your feet. I mean, that is a dance that takes practice, but it is also essential to learn.
Can you tell us a little more about how you've learned to deal with the media in that way?
I think I got some very good small pieces of advice very early. Which actually, to be honest, they were more to do with legal advice. It was about being very, very careful with the vocabulary that I used. So I remember a girlfriend of mine who's a criminal barrister, so not somebody in this arena, but I remember telling her that I was really nervous about speaking to a journalist because up until Harvey was put away, I was always on the edge of a legal case. And she said, just make sure that you never make any clear accusations. Never say, they did this, he did that. Always say, it felt like. Particularly when I'm talking about law firms and legal firms and lawyers and Harvey. But, never make a direct accusation. And it's funny, all those little tiny pieces of advice, and then before I went on Newsnight, which I was absolutely terrified about, I was very fortuitously, again, I was given a couple of hours, not media training, but I met with somebody from a media training outfit, and it just gave me a couple of little markers that empowered me so massively. Just things like when you're asked a question, that is, always take a moment, take a breath. And if you can't answer it immediately, go, that's an interesting question, so that your brain has a little bit of time to catch up with you. And, the majority of people who do campaign, and particularly if it's a very personal thing, you are very vulnerable. And you don't have any help. You don't have a publicist. You don't have a manager. You don't have a PR consultant. You don't have a lawyer. You don't have that network that most people who deal who are in the public domain have. And so those little pieces of information, certainly for me, were invaluable. But I think the most important thing is sticking to your integrity. And I think if you have integrity in what you're doing, it's very hard to knock someone down. Because it's not about being right or wrong factually. It's about your experience, and stick to your experience.
I think for a final moment of reflection, I'm sorry that I'm asking more words of wisdom from you and from the both of you, I guess. I'm sure a lot of our listeners might be having a moment of realisation that either they've signed a contract that might have had something that felt a bit iffy at the time but they weren't sure about, or that they possibly might have fallen down that trap and signed an NDA. I was just wondering what your advice would be, and obviously I want to draw back to Can't Buy My Silence and encourage our listeners to definitely go and have a look at the campaign. But for the both of you, what would be your takeaways?
Oh, I think that what's been the theme of what we're discussing today is around language and vocabulary and how we phrase things and how we see things. And I think campaigns like Can't Buy My Silence, but others around that are working in the whistleblowing space more generally to change the law, reframe how we think of disclosure, what it means, how we think of who gets to speak up. I mean, I was researching whistleblowing in financial services, for example, and there's a very specific set of norms around what you can say and what you can't. It's like we call it kind of a matrix of censorship. The minute you start a job, you learn what words you can use, what words you can't use, how things should be framed. We saw it in scandals in the UK in the last 12 months around the Lucy Letby case, for example, and doctors speaking up about what can and could not be said. Just some examples. I think what campaigns like this do is they reframe our rights as workers to speak, our rights as citizens to speak, our obligations and our duty, and really shine a light on how unethical and also illegal it is to contract people out of those rights. And so I think if we approach the things that we sign from that perspective, from the rights that we have as citizens and as workers, and when those rights are interfered with so that we can't speak out when something that really affects ourselves or other people is happening, that's a huge start and really what makes this kind of discussion, but also this kind of campaign so valuable. So it's around language.
I agree. I think, for me, there are three strings to the campaign, and they're all hugely important. But one of them is educating people as to their rights and to their own power. And the reason that most people sign an NDA or be gagged or whistleblow or not whistleblow is because they don't know their rights. And actually that information is quite hard to find. I would encourage anybody listening to this to please go to our website, because there's a huge amount of information there on what to do if you're being asked to sign an NDA, what to do if you've signed an NDA, some of the myths around it. But secondly, the best piece of advice I think I can give anybody is, no one has the right to treat your personal experience as IP and to take that away from you. That's a basic human right. Your experience is your right. And this is a conversation. I mean, one of the things that we're doing with the campaign at the moment is I'm speaking to sort of FTSE 100 companies and all the broadcasters who are know about NDAs a lot, to pledge to not use NDAs, as we have in the academic sector. And when I'm sitting in a room with the CEO of these companies and they're like, yeah, but how can you say when it's right or not to sign an NDA? It's really necessary to protect all of our employees. And you have to protect people who may have been falsely accused. And I'm like, it's really, really simple. You will never, if you look at an NDA, if an NDA is at any point going to stop somebody speaking up, if it's going to allow harm to happen in the future, whether it's a true accusation or not, if that NDA is going to stop the possibility of harm being exposed in the future, then it is wrong. An NDA is only there to protect trade secrets and intellectual property. So any agreement that could hide potential harm in the future, and that's essentially what we have in the Irish bill, which is the sort of landmark leading bill that we have about to go through. Basically, it's saying the victim can request to have an NDA. They can request to have one-sided confidentiality. But what you can't do is you can never have an agreement gagging information that could cause harm to a third party in the future. And that's the litmus test.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to the both of you, and thank you to our listeners. Please, if you have been affected by any of the issues that have been raised, you can look on our website, parrhesia.org.uk. Please subscribe to our channel to hear more about our content, and please reach out to us if there's any speakers or topics that you'd like to be discussed. But yeah, thank you so much, and please also check out Can't Buy My Silence to see about your own rights and also just to support the campaign. So yeah, thank you so much.
So Professor Kate Kenny, Zelda Perkins of Can't Buy My Silence, thank you very much.